Welcome to DJI Viewpoints, Tales from the Hood edition. If it wasn't already clear, this is a bit of obvious parody mixed in with real information, and it's not in any way actually endorsed by DJI. The Real Viewpoints is a blog site maintained by Chinese drone manufacturer Dazhang Innovations. I'm here today to talk about the data security practices of Dazhang, or in English, Great Frontier Innovation, generally known by the name DJI. Marketing trope, your data is none of our business, should be on your mind throughout this discussion. Fairly recently, there's been a huge push to paint specific drone industry concerns as simply being myths or tall tales. Without factual or complete information on hand, it can be easy for the common drone user to fall prey to misinformation or disinformation around these mythical topics. On social media, both DJI talking heads and the PR department are delivering a unified message using the same lines of rhetoric. In particular, DJI is really seeking as a company to associate drone bans with myths in the form of China fear and not security concerns. The approach honestly reminds me of a historic leaflet dropping during various times of war. Strategic carpet bombings of particular messages is often very effective. There are a few examples of social media comments that encourage end users to brush off security claims here. The tactic is generally to make privacy or security claims out to be absurd, illogical, and simply rooted in fear. The commentary also attempts to bolster claims that DJI has been appropriately and adequately audited by enough outside companies that it can make assertive statements on its own security posture. The comments seem to imply as such that end users should have no current worries on data privacy, and secondarily, that historically there have been no issues of note. The reality is that many of these audits have been scope limited or performed by groups with skill sets that may not simply be up to the task at hand. Oddly enough, these same comments often play on fear inherently present in the drone community, making use of a no true Scotsman fallacy, for example, further attempts to alienate users that don't conform to DJI's fear narrative. Similar to the partially out of context security studies, DJI employees like to highlight quotes from folks that have been inconvenienced by the inability to use their DJI branded drones. The quotes are often used as further evidence of malice at work. For those of you that are not familiar, Brendan Schulman is one of DJI's more prolific PR figureheads. He in essence serves as a talking head in a number of situations in the drone community as well. From his LinkedIn profile, his proper title reads as Vice President of Policy and Legal Affairs at DJI. In my personal opinion, some of Brendan's commentary is parroted from a level above him somewhere, and unfortunately he doesn't always have the solid technical information to back up the claims he makes on behalf of DJI. These are some examples of comments that Brendan has made in the past that I've looked at sideways at for one reason or another. Don't know how many of you seen Lord of War with Nick Cage, but I found there to be several parallels in the real-life Brendan and Nick's character in the movie. I've teased Brendan in the past about the weight that his words carry, given the nature of the product line he's representing. Back then it was about DJI products being used to deliver physical munitions on the battlefield. Now I find myself discussing data security and privacy nuances of the same product line that coincidentally also have potential impact on the battlefield. In this case, cyber as opposed to physical. To briefly remain on the war topic, I'm going to toss out a suggestion to read Unrestricted Warfare, which purports to be translated from PLA documents as written by two retired former Chinese officers. There are certainly interesting concepts in unconventional and asymmetric tactics with the intent to, quote, destroy America that are outlined within. Some folks may find the reading to be applicable in sorting out what exactly encompasses fear versus reality and what is probable when discussing a threat based in China in context of a specific country of origin ban on drone hardware. I personally got a chuckle out of the Chinese suggestion to attack a country via lobbying, given that Brendan specifically has roots in lobbying. DJI, of course, is undoubtedly making obvious lobbying efforts as well. This Unrestricted Warfare book has been discussed by a number of military strategists and military grad students alike. Reading various studies on the subject makes it fairly easy to understand what is often described as country of origin specific fear indeed may have some roots in reality. I find that some of the concepts in the book lend credence to dispelling the counter fears uncertainty, and doubt that DJI is using as a means to defend itself as a company. Processes by which the Chinese government often seeks to use suppression of dissent, humiliation of opponents, and doubters alike seems all too familiar to me on the DJI data privacy topic. You really, in this case, don't need to look any further than the anti-myths campaign that I mentioned earlier. I'm going to continue to give a bit more background story on this subject, and then I'll directly address each of the myths that DJI staff recently claimed to have busted. On the offhand event that this won't be enough in convincing you to take a deeper look at the situation, I'll be making ties to China's national level 5-year planning, or FYP system, and some of the technology solutions that DJI has implemented internally. I've always enjoyed reading works that are intended to sway the way folks think. That's perhaps why I'm so interested in the fact that DJI repeatedly spews security half-truths that few folks can systematically decipher. I've always kept on hand a copy of the Little Red Book for intellectual reading purposes. While writing content for this talk, I couldn't help but think of the quote about people being the decisive element in war as opposed to material things like weapons. Another quote that I often think about, in essence, suggests that you should let the enemy do the dirty work for you if you have the opportunity. Why directly poke a snake when you can have someone else do it for you? Although both quotes are supposedly attributed to the same person, one lacks a credible citation. There is, of course, some irony in the misattribution of a quote to Chairman Mao. Either way, I like this logic, and I'm going to attempt to strike a snake with DJI's own hand. I mentioned the Chinese 5-year plan a few slides back. It's in essence a series of pushes for economic and social development for the people of China. The process began in 1953, and the plans are established for the entire country and contain detailed outlines for progress within specific 5-year chunks. In the current plan, which covered 2016 to 2020, it should be noted specifically that there's a provision to implement the National Big Data Strategy. A number of people have written in the past few years about the 5-year plans, including this year's plan to focus on big data analytics. At the time when I started writing this, people were speculating on the release of the next plan, which was effectively pending immediately. Google searches seem to imply that we'll get a new variant any day. And from what I can see now, searching today, the plan appears to be out, at least in a draft proposal form. Given that the current plan is getting a bit long in the tooth, there are a pile of old documents on successful implementation or potential reference designs. I was able to find a document from the China Railway that outlined their efforts in conforming to the 13th FYP. I think it's a good document to keep in your head as you consider what DJI may or may not be doing with your personal data or data collected by drones that you interact with. One thing in particular of note is the reference architecture of big data platform slide from the Railway presentation. It specifically highlights user behavior analysis by big data, as well as massive data storage and massive data query. Additionally, the big data visualization for real-time status slide shows the tasks that are done by the railway system, essentially supported by the Chinese national policy on big data. This slide should certainly open your eyes a bit to the value of your drone flight log data to DJI as a company and in proxy the Chinese government. The China Railway big data implementation paper wound up being useful in a number of ways. I noticed the phrase, the reference architecture of big data platform, seemed to be unique to just that specific document, so I assumed it must have been a translation from another. Using Google Translate, I was able to identify the analog phrase in Chinese and use it to form new searches. A paper popped up claiming that it highlights the concept of the government big data platform and introduces the development history and development status of the government big data platform. After reading some of the concepts that center around both the 13th FYP and the government big data initiative, it's really hard for me personally to decouple some of DJI's business practices from FYP goals. There's a low probability, in my opinion, that such a large, visible, and successful Chinese company would be opting out of and choosing to not participate in national level efforts. Regardless of your opinion on if DJI is specifically participating, these papers are required reading when attempting to frame country of origin specific ban conversations. I'm going to come out and say that this specific country of origin may indeed be raising red flags that relate to data privacy concerns. Similar to the FYP plans, you'll find no shortage of commentary on the Made in China efforts. Current 5-year plan is basically bolstered by the Made in China 2025 marketing campaign that seeks to move China beyond being noted as simply the world's factory and into being a leadership position for high-tech solutions. If you're interested in the vision for this rebranding effort, there's an hour-long panel from the 2016 World Economic Forum that you can watch. The main focus seems to be in helping the world abandon thoughts of the word China, in essence equating to low-quality products. Everyone from FedEx to Forbes has had something to say on this topic. This infographic, in fact, comes from a FedEx blog post that's attempting to explain their view on the Chinese government plan for industry transformation. Online media has had a propensity for sharing success stories in the redefining Made in China landscape, and there's been articles in US media pretty well since the effort began. Certainly some level of self-acknowledgement that there's some growth required in order to move past the older, poor quality stereotype. And it almost gets comical to see the phrase repeated over and over in attempts to move from being a negative phrase associated with low quality to something more powerful. Redefining Made in China seems to be some sort of template, boilerplate buzzword. And DJI is certainly a willing participant in pushing the strength of the Made in China product message. To be honest, they're one of the poster children for success of the program. DJI careers page, for example, proudly displays redefining what it means to be made in China. In the earlier days of the effort, DJI not only won an award for its innovation, it had a secondary kudos come along for helping redefine Made in China at this same event. Frank Wang even has a video touting the success of DJI as a vehicle to help spread the message that there are indeed high-quality products made in China. If you've been paying any attention to the US news lately, you've probably heard the term BGY being tossed around by certain circles. I felt it was pertinent to mention the concept here to help paint more of an understanding on why the so-called country of origin bans may indeed have some merit. The term BGY seems to originate from an exiled Chinese billionaire known as Miles Kwok, or Guo Wenjui. In 2017, Kwok claimed to be blowing a whistle on China's plan to ruin the United States. He outlined the specifics of the BGY acronym, claiming that each color represented an area of specific Chinese adversarial focus. There are various bits of information that may be noteworthy in his claims, but it's really hard to tell overall. The main constant in his claim is that China is in the act of executing BGY against the US now. Ironically, former senior White House strategist Steve Bannon's G News is part of Kwok's Wow Media Network. And G News is, of course, responsible recently for helping showcase the content from Hunter Biden's so-called laptop from hell. In one example from that particular discussion, G News produced a diagram of unknown origin that seemingly lays out the details of how BGY functions in practice. Keeping that landscape in mind, I'd certainly take the commentary with a grain of salt, to say the least. There seems, unfortunately, to be no shortage of misinformation, for example, out of G News. Nonetheless, the mere concept of BGY seems to go hand in hand with national-level big data efforts. Having some sort of big data platform would almost be necessary to mine for nuggets of BGY. I found it slightly interesting to find what appeared to be a snarky comment on Twitter written in Chinese, making reference to both DJI's bans and BGY simultaneously. One other related Chinese government program that's worth mentioning to help frame the context I'm looking for you to pick up on is the 10,000 Talents program. This is another topic that countless entities have written studies on and reports. I encourage you to read up beyond my mere mention of it here, but the term useful idiot seems to sum up the concept quite well. In a nutshell, this is a tactic used by the Chinese to help get skilled individuals noted for their expertise in a particular subject matter to come be on Team China, for a lack of better words. You folks have suggested to me that this is a technique that DJI has used in its new hire practices. A few employees come to mind when I personally think about who would be beneficial to have on staff for DJI. Brendan, of course, is an obvious pick. Why wouldn't they want, the most famous celebrity-level drone lawyer to be representative of the company? Sounds like a no-brainer. Another employee is Ben Popper, a former editor at The Verge. Again, a seemingly no-brainer hire talent-wise. Historically, Ben was responsible for a number of articles about DJI products, in some cases, candor and outright reviews. Some of the articles were not necessarily favorable for DJI press-wise. Other articles questionably blended the lines between news, marketing, and hype generation. Some of Ben's articles were rather critical to the data security and privacy images of DJI. Each of the major stories around DJI privacy seemed to feature articles by Ben, subsequently pushed by The Verge. As expected, Ben also covered DJI's large misstep and prematurely launched bounty program. After looking at a few of his historic headlines, it isn't hard to figure out why DJI may want to be able to temper his voice and move it under their direct control. 3 months after his last critical article, Ben finds himself on DJI staff as a content writer. In the past, Ben would have been soliciting folks involved to write impactful stories on DJI, but I don't think that's something they have to worry about any longer. Ben can now instead be found soliciting stories for DJI. So there's certainly no irony lost in my mind seeing Ben go from being a DJI fanboy and excited reviewer to covering impactful stories to subsequently being on staff as a content creator. I want to take a brief moment to point out again that these are my personal opinions or my view of reality. I hope you enjoy the ride either way, but it'd be negligent of me to fail to point out that my own correlations do not imply any sort of causation. I'm doing my best to avoid stereotypes, but I make no promises about satire or hyperbole. Can't stand the term subject matter expert, but on this topic, unfortunately, that's what many folks look at me as being. I often feel like there's a pile of propaganda about I'm simply trying to help others navigate it. In reality, maybe I'm just crazy. Who knows? Sadly, much of what I'm attempting to highlight is something that many folks are flat out desensitized to. Social network usage is ingrained in many of our lives for those of our family members and our real friends. The cold reality is you can't use these platforms without allowing them to consume data about you. Once they do, there's little to stop what is done with the data after the fact. Policy and laws only go so far. Many people didn't even remotely care until recently when Cambridge Analytica exposed the micro-targeting practices in mass that can have catastrophic real-world impacts. Micro-targeting goes so much deeper than delivering ads on Facebook. If you're still on Facebook, yet have no clue what I'm talking about right now, I suggest you navigate to the banned apps help page and see if anything had access to your account. In the case of Cambridge Analytica app, this is your digital life. In some cases, your friends could have exposed your data just the same. For what it's worth, I'm not exactly sure what it means when Julian Assange calls your platform the most appalling spying machine that has ever been invented, but that happened to Facebook. If you've not seen it, you may consider watching The Great Hack on Netflix, which outlines the semantics of this incident with Cambridge. For some reason, this political cartoon of Google has always stuck with me over the years. I can't seem to find a version where the artist is attributed, but I feel like it's from around the early 2000 era. A more modern variant depicts Google as a giant compared to a much more amateur Facebook and Big Brother, whom they were depicted as being previously. Obviously, Feds is a Big Brother reference in the first political cartoon. The truth is that the jokes have some root in reality. Google has had headline after headline over the years about various missteps in data handling. You can see a few of them here as quick examples. If that wasn't enough, some of the deeper roots in government ties have come to light similarly over the years. As mentioned in the last slide, various links between our own government and social media platforms get exposed more and more over time. And learning about programs like our own government's X-Key store is concerning in and of itself. In context of this discussion, though, perhaps a more concerning thing is that U.S. citizens specifically have had their data exposed in a number of breaches tied to China. That raw ability to process and correlate across this data set certainly helped those theoretical BGY operations that I mentioned earlier, to say the least. At this point, most of the people that I encounter just flat out don't care. They feel it does not impact their day-to-day lives enough to concern them, and many are literally comfortably numb. So back on the direct topic of DJI as a drone company and their specific data security practices. Now that you all have the core materials on hand, I can help paint you a better picture regarding potential myths. DJI Inspire product launch in 2014 really brought on the opportunity for DJI's modern data platform. The story of their data security practices really start here. That same year, the beta of the DJI Pilot app started the data collection program with a landscape that almost gamified the pilot experience. both encouraging uploads and highlighting the best pilot stats. By 2016, folks in the community had become concerned and were wondering what data they were sending to DJI and where it was going after they did. In the press around that same time, a new employee, quote, misspoke about DJI's ability to hand the Chinese government video or flight log data when it's requested to do so. My personal research in the DJI security community started around the same time as I seek to answer the question, is DJI spying on us? I, in essence, began attempting to quantify the risks people began to have concerns about. In the summer of 2017, DJI had its first bounty program and first bans as a result of various entities conducting threat assessments and security research. Just like 2Live Crew, DJI found themselves banned in the USA, among other places. In parallel with the bans, I helped form a group of targeted researchers called the Slack OGs that focused on DJI security and privacy. We wound up being responsible for disclosing DJI's questionable application hot patching practices, both on Android and on iOS. We compromised their SSL key for star.dji.com and the AES key for their flight controller binary encryption. It's worth mentioning that DJI chose to scapegoat an individual and actually jail him over that specific AES key leak. When the time came and DJI established a bounty program to help reward our group, we wound up compromising their infrastructure several ways to Sunday across multiple OG members. I was personally offered their top prize of $30,000 in one instance. Been a rolling cascade of bans and controversy over DJI data practices since this time frame started. Pentagon has issued bans. Department of Interior has issued bans. Ban attempts extend up to this day with the current proposal of the American Security Drone Act, in which you'll find some of the country of origin specific concerns that DJI is railing hard to discredit, chastise, and delegitimize. The current strategy has been to make the bill out to be an attack on the drone end user as opposed to an attempt to help keep data secure and privacy intact. The latest news is that the bill has been referred to the House Committee on Oversight and Reform, meaning that it's not passed yet. DJI has plenty of time to attempt to downplay the need for such a policy or to paint it out as being unfair against them. It honestly has a decent probability of failing on its own at this point. Over the past 3 years, I've talked to a number of civilian folks that just can't understand why DJI branded drones would be banned or how they could pose a privacy concern in the first place. I suspect many of these same people have forgotten how shocking it was to discover U.S. military bases were potentially compromised by heat maps generated from online fitness tracker Strava. DJI's capability pretty well mirrors what Strava was capable of, and more when you consider their sentiment mining capabilities. This topic concerns a number of people, and in my mind, rightfully so. I've as such actually amassed quite a challenge coin set from talking to various government and military affiliated contacts just the same. In my opinion, DJI's internal big data programs are the equivalent of what you get when you cross a late 90s horror movie with Chinese-based ground control software and infrastructure. It's been 3 years since DJI and I were unable to come to an agreement regarding their bounty program, monies owed to me, and my right to disclose the things that I found on their AWS share. I thought long and hard about how to handle these things that I saw, in many cases notifying the appropriate authorities. I felt responsibility regarding compelled disclosure, although DJI seeks specifically to prevent me from doing exactly that. I keep arriving back on the UpGuard model for discussing things found on public AWS shares, more or less a full disclosure approach with minor redactions. UpGuard has discussed a number of sensitive AWS findings in the past, including Booz Allen and Pentagon files leaked on open shares. For the most part, I've chosen to adopt the same approach, but I've decided to not redact as I don't see anything sensitive being discussed here. In my opinion, UpGuard did not pull any punches, and I won't either. Keeping all that in mind, the following screenshots are from documents found on DJI's AWS shares circa 2017. They expose the capability of the big data collection programs known as DJI Sentinel and Supervisor. Unfortunately, DJI kept backups of their GitLab infrastructure on AWS, and a number of things I'm sure that the company would prefer not to discuss were found in said backups. In particular, their GitLab instance disclosed the details of their data platform. And with it, DJI's goal is to perform public opinion analysis via personal information cross-matching with an end goal of generating a user portrait or fingerprint. I find in particular that it's hard to find any DJI employees willing to recognize their Sentinel program that's intended for sentiment mining. Even if you can corner someone into loosely recognizing the program's existence, they tend to be flat out unwilling to speculate on what the program is actually for, how it's been used, and to what extent. In a nutshell, DJI is very invested in how you think about them and about drones in general, so much so that they've created a data platform to consume data about your opinion, as well as a means to link your opinion with your personal data. At the end of the day, the goal is to be able to help adjust your opinion to ensure it's swayed towards concepts that embrace both DJI and drones in a positive light. The documents are fairly self-explanatory. In this case, you're looking at a timeline for the creation of the project. The document indicates it was active as of December 2016. At that time, the platform had 146 data interfaces with 72 registered users. It's unclear how the project evolved since then, but it certainly got off to a productive start nearly 4 years ago. A secondary program known as Supervisor was also revealed in the AWS documents, indicating that DJI was performing large queries across the opt-in data that was provided by their users. DJI employees are able to make queries against all the flight log files as uploaded by users of their product line. This data is considered to be opt-in and is in essence donated to DJI. In particular, the flight logs are being pushed to Elasticsearch infrastructure for mass processing and visualization, subsequent redistribution of the data, of the visualization data and statistics. You can see here a heat map of takeoffs per country for 2016. And a friend of mine joked that he was pretty sure he could see oceanic oil exploration hotspots by staring at it as well. The interface also allows for free-form searches across all collected application logs. One talking point that DJI repeats over and over is that unless you give them data, they don't have it. The reality is many of their users have given them data both accidentally and on purpose. I've included a photo of DJI employee Romeo Dersher's flight logs as pulled off their AWS server as an easy conversation point. Romeo is the Senior Director of Public Safety Integration at DJI. I've teased him for years about processing his logs. I figured I ought to just make it happen. You can see one of the places he took off from in the maps attached. Google search revealed Romeo flying the same place previously. Maybe this is a great place to spy new DJI products being tested. Mavic 3 sighting anyone? I briefly teased Romeo when I processed these logs, and indeed, this was a historic DJI flight testing location. The main point is once DJI has the data, there's nothing preventing them from processing said data. Likewise, the folks that previously had access to the AWS shares before myself are in no way prevented from consuming the logs. As it stood at the time, they were not encrypted on DJI servers. If you make a GDPR or CCPA request, you should be able to obtain any log files that DJI still has on their servers. I've shown mine here alongside Romeo's for posterity. You can email support.privacy@dji.com to request to make a request to obtain yours for what it's worth. Alternately, a number of you have already asked, and yes, you can contact me, and I can let you know if I see your logs in the data set from AWS in 2017. In addition to any big data processing desires that DJI may have, it's clear that this log collection apparatus is eventually meant to be a mechanism or function of the unmanned aircraft traffic management services that DJI aspires to provide. UTM space is something that DJI has been slowly pushing into from both a regulatory standpoint with their lobby efforts and a product standpoint with their Aeroscope offering. Their own internal documents flat out state the importance of online data to the system. They also tout the ability to throw an alert when a UAV violates regulations and mention dispatching orders to the police on duty. The API documentation mentions a real-time monitor featuring pilot name, lat-long coordinates of the aircraft in question. The code on the AWS server indicated there was also some sort of integration for a, quote, gun for anti-drone. And documents describe what they call the police system, which includes an app and a handheld counter gun. This is all interesting to see, considering DJI's attempts to vilify the counter drone industry in the past. Either way, you can see this little guy in the corner representing this workflow in which a police officer is dispatched to handle some sort of rogue drone with what is obviously a gun, most likely a jammer. I should take a second to point out that this landscape is in the process of being legitimized further through the sales of the Flight Hub platform, which is in essence a slimmed down interface to the much larger data set that DJI possesses. They'd love to highlight that your logs are stored on a US-based AWS server, but let's be honest with each other, that is nothing to prevent either DJI or the Chinese government from accessing said data. In my opinion, until DJI allows end users to control the keys used to encrypt stored logs on the drone, in transit over telemetry, and at rest on their servers, their talking points are worthless on this specific feature. It does literally nothing to prevent compromise by having a server physically located in the US. Now that that's all out of the way, you have what is, in my opinion, a much better foundation to start discussing the quote myths as presented by DJI. So let's wrap this up by discussing each of the 5 common myths that DJI has recently addressed. Myth number 1, DJI drones automatically send pictures and flight information to DJI or to China. This specific myth is what got me into DJI security in the first place. This is perhaps one of the longest standing topics in the community. DJI's response to this concern often consists of carefully worded phrases that attempt to outright sidestep a real response. DJI likes to lean heavily on reports that state their products do not automatically upload log files, even going so far as to make that claim to the Senate Commerce Security Subcommittee. In my personal opinion, this myth confirms itself. It only takes a few searches to immediately turn up a conflicting narrative about the ability of the drone software to send logs back automatically. The only question really is secondarily on if they are sent to China, quote, automatically. I personally find that to be a ruse. I'm more interested in China being able to reach in and retrieve data at will. The mere mechanical aspect of automatic transmission to China specifically doesn't concern me much at all. The reality is they can automatically be sent and do automatically get sent. Although it is technically a function within user control, there have been documented bugs in the feature over time, some of which involve the setting defaulting to on. DJI isn't interested in talking about this, however. You can literally open the DJI app settings and see auto sync flight records as an option. This is self-explanatory and in my opinion confirms this myth outright. DJI privacy documentation makes no secrets about the fact that they will analyze a user's flight history. They always go out of the way to point out DJI cannot share customer data it never receives. Sadly, from here, their words are a bit misleading as they make a false claim that the user must manually use the sync button. Of course, we just saw that there is indeed an auto sync setting. Perhaps this is a simple clerical error on their end as opposed to an outright lie or an omission of truth. As mentioned before, Flight Hub has also started to legitimize this landscape of flight log management by DJI's cloud. And in fact, it also touts the feature that it automatically uploads. You literally only need to open DJI's own documentation to bust this myth. I can honestly give an entire presentation on the snapshot in time that represents DJI getting busted for doing hot patching via Tinker and JPush. Without getting overly verbose, the hot patching landscape enabled DJI to do whatever the heck they wanted with your mobile device with regards to pushing unverified application code with the DJI Go app. Targeting a specific user or drone with a malicious application payload was 100% possible when this practice was discovered to be implemented in DJI software. So obviously, if they wanted to take log files via this mechanism, they could have. DJI PR painted the hot patching out as an accidental inclusion of some third-party libraries. However, they had intentional tooling to support and use it on their back-end servers. This was no accident. It was part of the data platform. I want to make it clear that there is no technological major that prevents Chinese DJI employees or government officials from reaching into DJI infrastructure and accessing flight logs. There simply isn't one, period. Not even a US-based AWS data store will help change that fact. DJI's own ability to furnish me with my 2017 flight logs via email this past month is about as much evidence as you need, in my opinion, to support this claim. Keeping in mind that the DJI support privacy team is based in Shenzhen, my log files came to me in clear text via a Chinese mail server with a Chinese IP block. So please tell me again, China can't access my logs? The whole to China aspect of this myth is a complete ruse. Log files don't have to go to China when China can simply come get them at will. Myth number 2, DJI customer data will be shared with the Chinese government. Keeping in mind the fact that there are no technological measures in place to prevent said access, we can at least discuss this secondary claim. Given all that's already been said about the 13th five-year plan and the national big data efforts in China, I think one would be foolish to imply that one of the largest and more successful companies in China would not be participating in such a high-level and highly visible national-level project. It just seems unlikely. I'll point out that the documents we're looking at now are written in Chinese, and since I don't speak it natively, sometimes it's hard to understand the context. But for example, here, I can't tell if they say they cooperate with the Ministry of Information Security or, with the Ministry of Information Security to comply with standards, or with the information security arm of their IT department. I'll let one of you do some homework and let me know. I don't think DJI is interested in clarifying at this time, sadly, either way, as this program officially doesn't exist. DJI claiming that they're not interested in capturing user data is flat out factually inaccurate. Claiming that they're not interested in capturing it for advertising, generally speaking, would be fallacious as well. They may not capture user data with the intent to sell to other marketing operations, but they certainly use it for their own internal efforts. Once you begin to consider that DJI has their own internal consumers of this data that centers around business requirements and a desire to, quote, break the user black box and deliver precise advertising, it gets a little weird. DJI claiming that users have complete control over how the data is collected is not even anywhere near accurate. There's not, as to my knowledge, a way to opt out of the Sentinel sentiment mining program, for example. Managing your data that they have collected can be even more of a nightmare. I spent over a month asking over and over and over for DJI to produce my personal data, literally with them arguing every step of the way. Eventually, they produced all of the data for one of my 3 accounts that I asked for. I'm actually still waiting on data for the other 2 accounts. And I haven't even started to ask to delete them all. And when I do, I have zero way to prove that they did anyway. I know DJI did a really good job pouncing on an opportunity to ridicule a leaked ICE report when they had a chance. Despite its technical inaccuracies in several places, it's clear that whomever provided this intelligence was on the right track. I do want to point out that this exact log file processing landscape was mentioned in said report as an application that would digitize UAS pilot log data. Given all that's been said, particularly about DJI Supervisor program, I'm going to call this one plausible. Myth number 3, DJI is funded, owned, or controlled by the government of China. This is a myth that you kind of have to be careful with and read between the lines a little bit. I think the best way to do that is to get an idea of how funding from Hong Kong University of Science and Technology works. Frank Wang's success story starts with his first infusion of prize money after winning a contest with his classmates from HKUST. This video actually discusses some of his early days at the university from a perspective of a professor that was obviously pivotal in nurturing both Frank's success and that of DJI. Professor Lee, Frank's mentor, seems to have similar student success stories follow him around, encouraging students to start businesses and then incubating them through HKUST as a direct and indirect funding vehicle seems to be his MO. Another part of Frank's success story seems to hinge on the good faith of a family friend investing a large sum of money into his efforts. The story of Frank's start is almost mythical at this point, involving him staying up late nights, pounding Red Bull, and failing tests. So the incubation techniques from HKUST obviously played a huge role in the fast tracking of DJI's product dominance in the marketplace. Even at face value, HKUST currently hosts DJI headquarters in one of its buildings, so we'd be foolish to think that there was not a number of benefits associated with that alone. And at the very least, HKUST space and equipment are at DJI's disposal. So maybe owned or funded is not accurate, but deeply involved with or hosted by is more than a fair statement to make. The landscape of government policies to leverage and supply chain support alone just doesn't happen for many other drone companies, certainly not here in the US. We definitely have passionate professors and folks in positions to help incubate and push contract vehicles, but the DJI success story obviously benefits from a much more well-oiled machine meant specifically to pump out successful companies. Wang's success was fostered from the moment it was discovered and has been held up high as a successful example ever since. DJI's success, in essence, put it at the center of this incubation landscape as the best case example of what cooperation between government, industry, and academia and research facilities look like. The mere fact that DJI headquarters is housed in HKUST Shenzhen Research Institute should give you an idea of the level of support that DJI receives even to this day. DJI as a company is the poster child for HKUST entrepreneurship program, much like Wang himself is for HKUST. Wang's original company, iFlight Technologies, is listed as a spin-off of this entrepreneurship program. DJI is listed as one that is currently hosted by SRI just the same. The reality is, even Frank himself implies that without the help of HKUST, he'd not be where he is today, and obviously nor would DJI. His experience before DJI certainly leaves some things to be desired, to say the least. His resume is literally blank pre-DJI. My personal opinion, I think it would be hard to argue that the various funding programs and incubation techniques being pushed by HKUST didn't have a profound impact on DJI's success. Pretty much every turn you take, DJI's success story is pitched as a win for HKUST. If it isn't being pitched as a success for HKUST, you often see DJI mentioned alongside combined educational, governmental, and industry collaborations. At the end of the day, even the most basic tracking of DJI funding gets difficult when you consider that historically, DJI started off as iFlight Technology Company Limited and is actually fractured into many similar small legal entities, each with its own stakeholder. At the very least, it's fair to say that the lines are blurred. DJI obviously has a two-way beneficial relationship with HKUST, which is arguably a source of government funding. HKUST gets the benefit of Wang as its poster child, which obviously attracts more students. Wang being on faculty, of course, helps blend funding lines a bit. The natural flow of funding going to interns and grants for research projects to help develop algorithms that will ultimately benefit DJI has an obvious impact just the same. The bond is so strong between DJI and HKUST that there's now a joint innovation lab hosted at HKUST facilities for DJI. In my opinion, the HKUST DJI lab is yet another example of the incubation and nurturing offered by the university that DJI has been able to take advantage of. Students subsequently graduating from HKUST and going on to work at DJI, having in essence been pre-trained, has obvious benefits as well. The arrangement is obviously very lucrative to the point that it boasts securing major government and industrial funds. One specific research assistant claimed to assist in bringing in 20 million plus HK dollars, or about 2.5 million US. The HDJI lab, as it's sometimes called, is advertised for the role of helping to secure funding, including grant money specifically as recently as 2018. If you look around enough, you can find the various projects in which the grant monies were applied. Obviously, any algorithms or techniques developed by this process will directly benefit DJI's product line. I was on the fence about calling the educational landscape of incubation, grant money infusion, lending of manufacturing facilities, and students funding, but in context of DJI's success, it is extremely hard to ignore. In my opinion, this myth is confirmed. Myth number 4. DJI stole other companies' technology or intellectual property. The past 2 decades brought on a very rapid advancement of the UAV scene. So-and-so stole this, that, and the other has been a constant accusation or thought for many folks. Parallel research paths explain away some of the conflicts, and others are explained by the mere presence of several open source projects operating in the landscape. At the very least, both Autopilot for helicopter UAVs, originally shared in 2001, and Paparazzi Autopilot, created in 2003, were both around before Frank Wang took part in the HKUST electrical engineering class in 2005. Wang did claim an accomplishment of being the world's first autonomous flight at Mount Everest in 2006, but it wasn't until 2011 that we saw any sort of formal paper published on autonomous helicopter work. The landscape had already been started by that point, to say the least. DJI was technically founded in 2006 and did not release a flagship product until 2008. Chris Anderson had started DIY drones in 2007, and his partner Jordy had an autonomous helicopter up by 2008. Their work, known as Argicopter, then became a proper project in 2009. The scene had many parallel players. As one of those folks playing in that sandbox, I vividly recall jokes about theft not being a thing in the open source world. Creative Commons licensing was highly disputed, for example, but in most cases, finding someone to enforce an NC clause for a non-commercial use was impossible. GPL violations are viewed in a similar fashion. Basically, as an open source developer, you make the choice to share your work, so in context, others don't even have to steal it. It should be noted that DJI has long refused to share their GPL changes. In fact, their open source page hasn't been touched in 3 years. I can firmly say the only reason it's there in the first place is because I had one of the BusyBox stakeholders threaten to sue them. They have since ignored requests to share the Linux kernel on the LC 1860 platform literally for 3 years. Some folks in the GPL community do consider this theft when you don't share back the things you use and change. Companies have actually been sued successfully over GPL violations. Projects like OpenPilot and ArduPilot shared their logic out in the open as DJI developed its closed platform. After compromising DJI's AES key via GitHub, I did actually take a moment to check for any obvious one-to-one plagiarism and was not immediately able to detect any. That doesn't at all mean that public algorithms weren't studied and adapted from other open source projects. I think it's probably most fair to just say that many of the industry leaders stood on each other's shoulders, and we'd be fools to think that Frank was any different. I don't think there's any real way to bust this myth. I'm of the opinion that we could call this confirmed based on the GPL use alone, but that would be really lazy. Perhaps steal is too harsh of a word, maybe borrowed is a better choice. Much of this landscape was open sourced and based on public academic research after all, but I'm going to call this one plausible given all of that. And this is the last one, myth number 5. DJI succeeded in the US market by dumping products below cost. I'm going to call this one busted solely from a pedantic nature alone. DJI does deserve some credit for their rapid innovation. The specific claim that they succeeded solely on dumping alone would be crass. This one doesn't really require much discussion, in my opinion. Early consumer drone choices were far and few, and by the time Colin Gwynn entered the DJI picture, the hype was well earned. Company growth is depicted in this 2017 presentation, which if we take at face value, we can make the fair statement that they were well on their way to success before they started their dumping practice depicted in 2015 by the ICE report. It's hard to disagree that accelerated success would have been the result of any dumping practices that DJI chose to employ. This remains true even in the presence of the, quote, deeply flawed logic in the ICE report that first mentioned this practice. Although admittedly flawed in some areas, the ICE report indeed does contain valuable information on the subject of potential DJI dumping. Bill of materials costs alone for the drones could get difficult to calculate when you consider HKUST's role in incubation, equipment manufacturing facilities, and complementary business relationships. It isn't hard to see why there's an unfair advantage depicted. Nonetheless, I'm going to call this one busted, as there's really no direct evidence on hand, and the timelines just flat out don't match up with the start of DJI's success. So, all right, that wraps up my examination of the busted myths regarding Dazhang Innovations, the Chinese drone company. I hope that was useful in providing additional information on why country of origin specific drone concerns and myths cannot be simplified as just being fear alone. The conversation is much more complex than the words "because China." Thank you for your time. That's it.